Now I will tell you about the most important secret stories. Who do you think actually built medieval castles? The answer will definitely shock you. We look at majestic medieval castles and imagine knights in shining armor and noble lords ruling their lands. Their names have gone down in history, their portraits hang in galleries. But what if I told you that the real creators of these stone giants remain invisible, erased from the pages of history? History remembers the kings who commissioned the construction, but has forgotten the tens of thousands of hands that dragged, hewed, and laid each stone. They were not knights or aristocrats. They were ordinary people whose lives were filled with hard, monotonous labor from dawn to dusk. We admire the height of the towers and the thickness of the walls, but we do not think about the price at which they were built.
Keep the ropes tight.
It was a quiet, daily battle with heavy stones, capricious weather, and the limits of human strength. It is their story, untold and forgotten, that is hidden in every seam between the stone blocks.
Get your backs into it.
Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how the giant construction machine of the Middle Ages actually worked, and who was the nameless hero whose sweat and labor created the most impregnable fortresses in history. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of the Middle Ages. Castles were not built by lords, but by an entire invisible army whose names have been lost to history. At the foot of the growing fortress, life was bustling in a huge temporary settlement resembling a beehive. Thousands of people, peasants, craftsmen, laborers, formed the backbone of this army, the invisible foundation of the Lord's greatness. Many of them were peasants who worked off their feudal obligations, known as corvée labor. They were taken away from the fields for weeks or months to perform the hardest unskilled work. They dug ditches, carried earth and stones, and carried out orders without asking questions. For them, the construction of the castle was not an act of creation, but a heavy duty, part of their harsh life. They were not paid for this. Their labor was simply used as a natural resource. Their contribution was enormous, but completely anonymous. In addition to serfs, free workers flocked to the construction site in search of earnings. These were people who had left the land, ready for any work for modest pay and food. Their lives were little easier than those of the peasants, but at least they had the illusion of choice. This huge mass of people needed to be organized. They were managed by overseers and foremen who monitored the pace of work and discipline. Their task was to turn a motley crowd into a well-coordinated mechanism. The social gap between the lord in his tent and the simple digger in the ditch was insurmountable. They lived in different worlds, even though they were on the same construction site. One was creating a symbol of his power, while the others were simply trying to survive another hard day. Women also took part in this titanic work. They carried water and sand and helped prepare food for the huge army of workers. Their labor was just as hard and just as invisible. This gigantic workforce was a temporary phenomenon. After the main work was completed, most of these people simply dispersed. They returned to their fields and villages, leaving behind the stone giant they had helped to build. The history of the castle is not only a history of architecture, but also a history of thousands of forgotten lives. These people left no memoirs. Their faces are not captured in frescoes. The only monument to their labor is the walls themselves, which still stand today. Modern historians are piecing together a picture of this grandiose construction project. By studying economic records and archaeological finds, they are giving a voice back to those who were doomed to silence. We would be very interested to hear your opinion. Why do you think history has treated these people so unfairly, leaving only the names of aristocrats in our memory? Write about it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. What if I told you the astonishing fact that the vast majority of magnificent medieval castles were built without a single detailed drawing in the modern technical sense of the word, without plans, sections, or facades on paper? At the head of this grandiose construction process was one man whose Latin title was Magister Operis, or Master of Works in English. He was the chief builder and architect, a genius of his time and place. uniquely combining the functions of architect-designer, engineer-calculator, and foreman-manager in one person. He was a one-man orchestra, conducting a symphony of stone, wood, and human labor without a score on paper. Everything was in his head, communicated verbally and through actions, rather than through drawings, which were a luxury unavailable even to wealthy clients without a tradition of technical drawing. This legendary man did not sit in a warm office in the castle, bent over a drawing board with a compass and a ruler.
Heavy to the left.
His main working tools were primitive wooden templates, measuring ropes with knots, plumb lines for verticals, and his own colossal experience accumulated over decades of work. He kept the entire complex plan for the future multi-tower castle, covering hectares of land in his head, visualizing the three-dimensional structure without paper. A phenomenal spatial memory and imagination, trained by years of practice, allowed him to see the finished building in his mind long before the first stone was laid, anticipating problems and the solutions at the design stage. The master builder was not just a theorist detached from life with book knowledge, but a practitioner of the highest class with calluses on his hands. Most often, he himself came from a simple background of stonemasons and craftsmen, and slowly climbed the career ladder thanks to his outstanding talent, sharp mind, and hard work. He had a thorough knowledge of the physical properties of each type of stone: limestone, granite, sandstone, and wood species: oak, pine, ash, not from abstract textbooks, which did not exist, but by touch, sight, and the sound of a hammer blow, accumulating an empirical database of materials in his memory over years of working with them, which gave him an intuitive understanding that could not be achieved by theory without practice. He alone made all the key strategic decisions on the construction site without consultation. Where exactly to lay the foundation, taking into account the soil, what the optimal thickness of the load-bearing walls should be for stability, how to correctly position the narrow loopholes for better firing at the approaches without dead zones. Not only the aesthetic beauty and grandeur of the castle depended directly on his technical decisions, but also its critical defensibility and ability to withstand a siege lasting many months.
Look at the width.
A mistake in the calculations meant a breakthrough, capture, and death for the garrison. So the responsibility was enormous, and the master bore it alone, paying for failures with his reputation. To explain complex tasks to his illiterate masonry subordinates, he used simple and clear visual methods without words. He could draw a detailed plan of the future curved wall directly on the ground with a stick in full-scale 1.1 for understanding.
I did not think it would.
Or he would make precise wooden templates for complex arches and vaults with his own hands, which dozens of masons would then use to mechanically reproduce the shape without understanding geometry. The template was a language understandable to the hands, when words and numbers were useless to illiterate but skilled craftsmen who knew stone better than letters. The master builder was a zealous guardian of the professional secrets of the craft, passed down orally from generation to generation by teachers to students. Empirical knowledge of practical geometry, structural statics, and the resistance of materials to loads was his main intangible capital and competitive advantage. These precious secrets were jealously guarded within the closed workshop of Freemasons from outsiders. Disclosure meant the loss of a monopoly on knowledge and consequently income. So apprentices took vows of silence, and traitors were expelled from the brotherhood forever, deprived of their livelihood and reputation. For his unique work and responsibility, the master received very high monetary compensation, incomparable, 10 to 20 times more than the wages of ordinary laborers. He was a respected member of society, often working and communicating directly with kings and the most noble and powerful feudal lords as an equal in professional matters. His personal name was sometimes even mentioned in written chronicles and on foundation stones, which was a great historical rarity and honor for a person of low non-noble origin in a caste society. Talent opened doors closed to birth, proving that skill was valued above blood in the practical Middle Ages. He bore personal, legal, and moral responsibility for the strength and safety of the structure to the customer. The collapse of a wall or tower during or after construction would leave an indelible stain on his professional reputation for decades.
But will it withstand a...
Therefore, every critical stage of the work, laying the foundation, erecting arches, installing floors, was carried out under his vigilant personal supervision and quality control. He personally checked every stone, every joint, and every mortar, not trusting his subordinates blindly because the price of a mistake was too high. The collapse of his reputation meant the end of his career in poverty, so quality control was obsessive and total. Often, renowned masters were deliberately invited to work from afar, from other countries and kingdoms, if they were widely famous for their outstanding artistry and reliability. This is how the most important exchange of advanced technologies and architectural styles took place throughout fragmented Europe through the mobility of masters. The same talented craftsman could build an impregnable castle in England for the king, then move on and erect a majestic cathedral in France for the bishop, spreading innovation across borders faster than books, which were almost non-existent. People were the carriers of knowledge, not paper, and their movements were the movements of civilization. It was these anonymous geniuses of their time who were the true authors and creators of the architectural masterpieces of the Middle Ages that have survived the centuries. They uniquely combined artistic and aesthetic talent for envisioning beauty with sober engineering calculations of strength and stability. Their main living blueprint and plan was the stone castle itself, growing physically day by day. A method of iterative design through construction, where mistakes were corrected as they arose, rather than on paper in advance, which required flexibility of mind and the ability to adapt to reality, which differed from the ideal plan. These legendary people possessed unique knowledge of geometry and mechanics, which they consciously encoded in symbols and metaphors and passed on to their students orally and through rituals. But what if I told you the intriguing fact that every simple stonemason left his own unique and secret personal mark on the stones of the castle? The mark of the master? In the next chapter, we will try to decipher the secret language of stone and understand what these symbols meant to medieval builders and what they can tell us today about forgotten masters. What I am about to show you has been hidden in plain sight for centuries. If you look closely at the walls of ancient castles, you will notice strange marks on some of the stones: crosses, arrows, intertwined lines. These are not random scratches, but mason's marks, a unique marking system, a kind of personal signature of the master. This tradition was widespread throughout Europe and had several important practical applications. First of all, it was a system of quality control and accounting for the work performed. Each stonemason had his own unique mark, which he carved on the block he had worked on. This made it easy for the master builder to determine who had made a particular stone. If a block was found to be of poor quality, it was easy to find the person responsible. This encouraged masons to work as conscientiously as possible. In addition, these marks were used to keep track of production for the purpose of paying wages. At the end of the week or month, the overseer counted the number of stones marked by each craftsman and calculated the corresponding payment. It was a simple and effective piecework payment system.
48, 49, 50.
The marks were simple and easily recognizable, so that they could be quickly carved out with a chisel and hammer. They were often based on simple geometric shapes or initials, but sometimes there were more complex and intricate symbols. A craftsman received his personal mark after completing his training and joining the guild. This mark remained with him for life. It was his professional stamp, a guarantee of quality. When moving from one construction site to another, the craftsman took his mark with him. For historians, these marks are an invaluable source of information. They can be used to trace the roots of bricklayers' guilds throughout Europe. For example, identical marks found in castles in England and Normandy indicate that the same craftsman worked there. Sometimes the location of the marks can be used to reconstruct the construction technology. If the marks are grouped in one place, it means that one team worked there. This helps to understand how the work processes were organized on a giant construction site. But beyond their practical significance, these marks have a deeper meaning. They are the only trace left behind by thousands of nameless craftsmen. It is their way of saying across the centuries, "I was here, I built this." Today, there are entire catalogs of masons' marks collected by enthusiasts and scholars. It is like an attempt to restore the names of an army of invisible builders. Each deciphered mark is another fate returned from oblivion. Are you ready to learn the truth about how the construction of any castle actually began? Not with the foundation or the plan, but with the deafening roar of the quarry. It was here, far from the Lord's eyes, that what would later become majestic walls and towers was born. The quarry was the heart of the future construction, a place where every blow to the rock was the first step towards creating an entire fortification. Covered in dust and sweat, workers spent hours chipping away at the stone, with no idea where it would end up. In the foundation of a bridge, in the wall of a castle, or in its gates. This was the beginning of the most difficult and exhausting stage of the work, which required not so much skill as brute force, incredible endurance, and iron discipline. Choosing a location for the quarry was the first strategic decision on which the success of the entire construction project depended. Ideally, the quarry was located as close as possible to the castle construction site in order to reduce the time and cost of transporting stone. However, suitable deposits were not always available. Sometimes the necessary stone was located dozens of kilometers away, and then it was necessary to build roads, construct temporary bridges, and use carts pulled by oxen or horses. In some cases, the delivery of stone became a separate logistical operation, requiring the participation of dozens of people and weeks of labor. The further away the quarry was, the more expensive the construction was, so the choice of location often determined whether the castle would be built on time. The stonecutter's tools were simple but surprisingly reliable. The basic set included metal wedges, heavy sledgehammers, crowbars, and pickaxes, everything that the technology of the time allowed. Despite their primitiveness, in skilled hands, these tools became precise instruments capable of cutting stone with remarkable accuracy. Workers passed on the secrets of rock processing from generation to generation, perfecting their technique and striking power. Explosives did not exist at the time, so all the work was done by hand, by dozens of people whose movements merged into a rhythm reminiscent of the sound of a giant drum. The process of separating a stone block from the rock was incredibly difficult and required patience. First, the workers hollowed out a series of deep holes in the rock at equal distances from each other. This took hours and sometimes a whole day. Then, dry wooden wedges, cut with special precision, were inserted into these holes. Each wedge had to fit perfectly into the hole, otherwise the split would not be correct. The workers carefully monitored the installation process. Any deviation could cause the stone to crack offline and become unsuitable for construction. When everything was ready, the wedges were generously watered. This was a moment of anticipation and tension. The wood began to absorb moisture, slowly swelling. After a few hours and sometimes a whole day, the pressure inside the stone built up until finally there was a dull crack, turning into a loud bang.
Move!
A crack ran along the line of the wedges, separating the multi-ton block from the rock. This moment was always accompanied by joyful shouts. After all, each successful crack meant that it was possible to move on. The separated block had to be processed. Stonecutters used hammers and chisels to give it a rectangular shape, knocking off excess pieces and leveling the surface. This made it easier to transport and made the stone more suitable for masonry. Primary processing was carried out right at the foot of the quarry so as not to carry extra weight. Sometimes the stones were marked with signs so that later it would be clear where exactly to use them on the construction site. Work in the quarry was monotonous and exhausting. From sunrise to sunset, people worked continuously, striking the rock to break off pieces. The air was filled with dust that settled on the skin and clothing and entered the lungs. The clang of metal, the banging of sledgehammers, and the crackling of stone merged into one endless echo. The workers hardly spoke. The noise made it impossible. Their faces were covered with dirt, their hands with calluses, but no one stopped. Everyone understood that the castle would not build itself. The organization of labor in the quarry was clear and strict. There was a division of roles. Some drilled holes, others inserted wedges, and still others were engaged in cutting or transportation. Experienced craftsmen supervised the process and made sure that everything went according to plan. Violating the order was considered a serious mistake. One wrong move could ruin an entire block. Sometimes entire families worked in the quarries, and the profession was passed down from father to son. It was hard but honorable work because it was the foundation of the construction. The scale of extraction was impressive. Tens of thousands of cubic meters of stone were required for an average castle. The quarries worked non-stop for years while construction was underway. Even in winter, the work did not stop. People lit fires to soften the frozen ground and continued to work. After construction was completed, some quarries were converted into permanent industrial centers that supplied stone to neighboring cities. It was here, amid the dust, the clang of metal, and the heavy smell of sweat, that the power of the future walls was born. Each smooth block in the castle's masonry was once part of a faceless rock, and behind its transformation was the labor of hundreds of nameless people. These workers rarely saw the castle they were working for. But without them, there would have been no towers, no walls, no bridges. But how were these giant blocks, weighing several tons each, delivered to the construction site? In the next chapter, you will learn about the ingenious methods of medieval logistics. After a stone block was quarried from the rock and roughly cut, a new, equally difficult stage began: transportation to the construction site. This process was a real challenge for medieval engineers and workers. After all, it involved moving multi-ton blocks along roads that, in fact, did not exist. Any mistake could have been disastrous. If the cart overturned, all the work would be lost. Therefore, each transport required careful preparation, calculations, and coordinated actions by dozens of people. It was not just a stage of work, but a whole separate science, the science of moving stone. The most common method of transportation over short distances was horse-drawn. Stone blocks were loaded onto massive wooden sleds covered with iron, or placed on sturdy carts with thick wheels capable of withstanding enormous weight. Not 2 or 3, but sometimes up to 20 oxen were harnessed to such a team, powerful animals that were specially trained for such tasks. Their movement was measured and heavy, but they were the only ones capable of moving a stone weighing several tons. Sometimes, to make movement easier, wet sand was sprinkled under the runners, or freshly cut logs were laid down to reduce friction and prevent the sled from getting stuck. The movement was painfully slow, especially when the path was uneven. Every meter was difficult. On descents, the workers placed wedges under the wheels to prevent the cart from rolling down too quickly, and on ascents, they had to use levers and ropes to help the animals overcome resistance. Sometimes the journey took a whole day, even if the distance was only a few kilometers. To make the task easier, temporary roads were built, earth was piled up, bushes were cut down, and the roadside was reinforced. It was painstaking work that required the participation of dozens of people. If the path became too steep, simple mechanisms such as gates and winches came to the rescue. A wooden gate with long levers was installed at the top of the hill. A thick rope was attached to it, the other end of which was tied to a cart with a stone. Several workers turned the gate, pulling the rope and gradually lifting the heavy load upward. This method required enormous effort, but it allowed them to cope with a sense where animals could no longer help. Sometimes, if the road was too narrow or dangerous, the stone was pulled up by hand, using only human strength in a system of blocks. When the terrain allowed, builders tried to use waterways. Transporting stones by river and lake was much more efficient and safer than by land. One large ship could carry dozens of stone blocks, and as a result, what took weeks on land could be delivered in a matter of days by water. For this purpose, special piers equipped with lifting cranes were built at the quarries. These cranes were simple but reliable, wooden structures with rotating beams and ropes, operated by several people. With their help, the stone blocks were carefully lifted and transferred to a barge, taking care not to damage the corners or upset the balance. Transportation by water also required experience. The vessel had to withstand the weight of the cargo and not capsize at the slightest wave. Barges were often towed manually using ropes stretched along the shore, or sails were used if the wind was favorable. In some places, the riverbed was specially cleared along the banks, removing stones and snags so that ships could pass safely. Each voyage was accompanied by risk, but it paid off in speed and labor savings. In winter, nature helped the builders. Frozen rivers and lakes turned into ideal roads along which stones could be transported quickly and easily. The thick layer of ice could support the weight of sleds and oxen, and the blocks literally glided over it. In winter, it was possible to deliver cargo to places that were completely inaccessible in summer. Workers carefully checked the thickness of the ice and reinforced the route by sprinkling straw on the snow to prevent the animals from slipping. Sometimes in severe frosts, it was the winter roads that saved the construction schedule. The journey of a single stone from the quarry to the construction site took weeks and sometimes months. Every hill crossed, every river crossing was a small achievement. The people accompanying the cargo watched every movement, regularly lubricated the wheels, checked the ropes, and rested by the fires at night. The loss of a single block was considered a great misfortune, as it was impossible to replace it quickly. Each stone delivered was a real victory, the result of endurance, intelligence, and hard work. Transporting stone often cost more than extracting it. Sometimes the distance was so great that it was more economical to build a castle a little closer to the source of the material. Therefore, when choosing a location for construction, architects and lords always took logistics into account. The presence of rivers, plains, and roads could play a decisive role. Without reliable delivery routes, no castle could be built, no matter how wealthy its owner was. Building a castle in the Middle Ages was not only a matter for architects and craftsmen, but also a huge logistical operation. Everything depended on precise calculations, coordination, and the labor of hundreds of people. Every stone in the castle wall is a silent witness to a journey full of difficulties, ingenuity, and human perseverance. And perhaps this was the real strength of those castles, not only in their stones, but also in the people who brought those stones to the place where they were destined to stand for centuries. What if I told you that an entire forest had to be cut down to build a stone castle? As the walls grew taller, they were surrounded by a complex web of wooden scaffolding. This temporary structure was as important as the stone itself, because without it, it would have been impossible to lift materials and people to the heights. The scaffolding was based on long logs that were installed vertically along the wall. They were dug into the ground or placed on stone supports. These posts were connected by horizontal beams on which planks were laid. To ensure the stability of the structure, it had to be attached to the wall under construction. To do this, one end of the horizontal beams was inserted into special holes left in the masonry. After the scaffolding was dismantled, these square holes, called putt-log holes, often remained visible on the surface of the wall. The scaffolding was erected tier by tier as the walls grew. This was a job for the most experienced and fearless carpenters. They worked at dizzying heights without any safety equipment, relying only on their dexterity and the strength of the wooden structures. Workers carried buckets of mortar, tools, and small stones up these rickety platforms and ladders. It was a continuous flow of people and materials moving up and down. Movement on these wooden streets was strictly organized to avoid congestion and accidents. The scaffolding was not strong enough to lift heavy stone blocks. Special lifting mechanisms installed at the top of the wall were used for this purpose. But it was the scaffolding that provided access to all parts of the wall under construction. The amount of wood needed to erect scaffolding around a large castle was enormous. Thousands of the best tree trunks were required, which led to the felling of entire forests. The harvesting and delivery of this material was a separate and difficult task. Wooden scaffolding was very vulnerable to fire. A single accidental fire could destroy the entire structure in a matter of hours, setting construction back by months. Therefore, strict fire safety measures were observed at the construction site. After the castle was completed, the scaffolding was carefully dismantled. Wood was too valuable a material to be thrown away. Logs and planks were reused for the construction of roofs, floors, and interior partitions. So, when looking at the stone mass of the castle, it is worth remembering its wooden double. This temporary skeleton of logs was an integral part of the process of creating the fortress. Without it, the stone walls would never have been able to rise to the sky. But what held the stones together, turning them into a monolithic wall? In the next chapter, we will reveal the secret of medieval cement. Even if perfectly fitted together, Stone blocks could not form a solid wall without a binding element. This glue that held the castle together was mortar. Its production was a large-scale and technologically complex process on which the durability of the entire structure directly depended. The main component of medieval mortar was lime. It was obtained by burning limestone or chalk in special kilns. These kilns, made of stone or brick, worked continuously, burning wood around the clock and producing a valuable product. The burning process required maintaining a very high temperature for several days. The furnaces were monitored by experienced craftsmen who determined whether the product was ready by the color of the flame. It was a hot and demanding production process that required constant attention. After firing, quicklime, or kipelka, was obtained. It was a caustic and chemically active substance. To turn it into a building material, the lime had to be slaked, that is, mixed with water. The slaking process was accompanied by a violent reaction with the release of a large amount of heat. The mixture hissed and bubbled, turning into a plastic mass known as slaked lime or pushonka. This operation was carried out in special pits or dvorila. To obtain a building mortar, slaked lime was mixed with sand and water. Sand acted as a filler, reducing the shrinkage of the mortar as it dried and increasing its strength. The proportions of lime and sand were carefully selected depending on the quality of the materials and the purpose of the mortar. The quality of the mortar was critically important. Good mortar not only bonded the stones together, but also made the masonry more waterproof. The secrets of preparing the best mortar were a professional secret and highly valued. Sometimes various additives were added to the mortar to improve its properties. These could be crushed brick, egg white, or even cottage cheese. These additives increased the plasticity and water resistance of the mixture. The production of mortar required a huge amount of resources: limestone, wood for furnaces, sand, and of course, water. All these components had to be extracted and delivered to the mixing site. Entire teams of workers were engaged solely in ensuring this process. Thus, an entire chemical industry stood behind the strength of stone walls. The seemingly simple grayish mortar between the stones was actually the product of complex technology. It was the invisible force that turned a pile of stones into an indestructible monolith. As the castle walls grew taller, the builders faced an increasingly difficult task: how to lift heavy stone blocks, tools, and materials to the top. The solution to this problem lay in the use of simple but ingenious lifting mechanisms. The pinnacle of medieval engineering in this field was the large lifting wheel, or squirrel wheel crane. This mechanism consisted of a huge wooden drum mounted on an axle. Inside this drum, like squirrels in a wheel, one or more workers ran. With their weight and muscle power, they made the wheel turn. The rotation of the wheel was transmitted through the axle to a winch, onto which a rope was wound. A load was attached to the other end of the rope, a stone block or a bucket with mortar. In this way, the steps of several people inside the wheel were converted into a powerful lifting force. Such cranes were installed on the upper tier of scaffolding or directly on the wall being erected. They allowed loads weighing several hundred kilograms, and sometimes more than a ton, to be lifted. This significantly accelerated the pace of construction and facilitated the work of the workers. The work inside the wheel was monotonous and physically exhausting. The workers had to keep in step, maintaining a constant pace. The speed and safety of the lift depended on their coordination and endurance. In addition to large wheels, simpler lifting devices were also used. One of them was a winch, a horizontal drum with two handles. 2 or 4 people turning the handles, wound the rope, and lifted the load. Another common mechanism was the capstan, a vertical winch. Its advantage was that several people could push the levers for rotation at the same time. This allowed for greater force to be applied and heavier loads to be lifted. All these mechanisms were made entirely of wood. They were designed and assembled on site by the best carpenters. The strength of the wooden axles, gear wheels, and levers was the result of their vast experience. Operating such a crane required great skill. The operator, located at the top, used signals to direct the workers below who were attaching the load. Any mistake or lack of coordination could result in the load falling. These human cranes were the muscle power of construction. They were living proof that even without internal combustion engines, it was possible to solve the most complex engineering problems. It was thanks to them that medieval castles were able to grow to such impressive heights. Although the castle appears to be made entirely of stone, its construction would have been impossible without the participation of craftsmen who worked with other materials. Carpenters and blacksmiths were the other two pillars on which the entire construction project rested. Their role was no less important than that of the stonemasons. Carpenters were the true kings of wood. All the wooden structures necessary for construction came from their hands. They erected and dismantled the most complex scaffolding, without which the masons would not have been able to work at height. It was the carpenters who created the wooden templates and hoops for the arches and vaults. These auxiliary structures had to support the weight of the masonry until the mortar set. The perfect shape of the vault depended on the accuracy and strength of the hoops. Once the stone box of the castle was ready, the carpenter's work was just beginning. They installed massive floor beams, laid floors, and erected interior partitions. The entire filling of the castle was made of wood. The crowning achievement of their work was the creation of the roof truss system. It was a complex engineering structure consisting of dozens of beams connected without a single nail, using ingenious notches and wooden dowels. These roofs have stood for hundreds of years, serving as a monument to the art of carpentry. Blacksmiths, in turn, were the masters of metal. Their forge was the heart of the construction site, where hammers pounded deafeningly. The main task of the blacksmiths was to manufacture and constantly maintain a huge number of tools. They forged and sharpened thousands of chisels, picks, hammers, and wedges for stonecutters. Metal was expensive at that time, so every broken tool was not thrown away, but taken to the smithy for repair. A blacksmith had to be able to work quickly and efficiently. In addition to tools, blacksmiths made all the metal parts for the castle. Massive door hinges, window bars, bolts, locks, and, of course, thousands of nails of various sizes. Each of these items was the result of hard manual labor. Their work was also necessary for other craftsmen. Blacksmiths made axes and saws for carpenters, hammers and pliers for masons. Without their products, the entire construction would have come to a standstill. Thus, the construction of the castle was the result of the joint work of specialists in various fields. Bricklayers, carpenters, and blacksmiths worked closely together, depending on each other. Only their combined efforts could produce such a complex and intricate structure as a medieval castle. We are used to thinking about construction in modern terms: design, budget, completion date. But in the Middle Ages, everything was different. The construction of a large stone castle was not a matter of a few years, but of several decades, and sometimes even a whole century. For the people who lived at that time, this was the normal state of affairs. Construction that began in their childhood could end when they were already very old. Entire generations succeeded one another in the shadow of the growing walls. The pace of work depended heavily on funding. Construction proceeded actively as long as the Lord had money, but wars, crop failures, or political turmoil could freeze construction for a long time, and it would come to a standstill for years. The work was seasonal. In winter, when the mortar froze in the cold and did not set, the main masonry work stopped. At this time, the workers were busy preparing stone and timber for the next season. A boy who joined the construction site as an unskilled laborer could work his way up to become an experienced master mason without ever seeing the completion of the castle he had been building his entire life. The castle was not just a place of work, but a whole world in which their lives took place. Such long construction periods meant that the architecture of the same castle could feature elements of different styles. Construction began in the austere Romanesque style and ended in the elegant Gothic style. The castle grew and changed over time. The long construction period led to the formation of a permanent settlement around the castle. The builders constructed houses for themselves and started families. Thus, a town grew up next to the castle, whose life was inextricably linked to the construction project. The completion of construction was an event of enormous scale. It was a triumph not only for the Lord, who received a powerful fortress, but also for hundreds of builders. They were witnesses and participants in the birth of a stone giant. But even after the official completion, work on the castle never stopped. Repairs were constantly needed. Something was being added or rebuilt. The castle was a living organism that required constant care. Therefore, when looking at these ancient walls, it is worth remembering the human dimension of time. Behind each stone lies not just an hour of work, but a piece of a whole human life. And the sum of these lives, devoted to a common cause, is the true greatness of medieval castles. We have taken a journey into the past to see the true creators of medieval castles. They were not kings and knights, but a huge army of nameless stonemasons, carpenters, blacksmiths, and laborers. Their collective labor, endurance, and skill transformed piles of stone and wood into symbols of an entire era. History has been unfair to these people, erasing their names and leaving us only silent stones. But their legacy is more than just names in the chronicles. It is the castles themselves, which have survived the centuries and still amaze our imagination. Now, when we look at these majestic structures, we will see not only a symbol of power and wealth, we will see a monument to human labor, perseverance, and the genius of ordinary people. People who truly built the Middle Ages. What other secrets of history would you like to uncover? Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new explorations of the past.